Greetings. Peace be with you. So, I want to thank you for inviting me back again and again. It's quite flattering. First, our prayer for illumination. To the God who is the Spirit of wisdom, we ask that we are able to share in your wisdom today. Please open our hearts and minds to receive this message. Amen. So, our New Testament reading for today is actually a pretty familiar one. I'm sure these are words that many of you have heard many times before. It's from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm a resounding gong or a clashing cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection, as in a mirror. Then we will see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So, I'm going to talk about love. The title of my message is Love's the Only Engine of Survival. That comes from the lyrics of a song by a great Canadian songwriter, Leonard Cohen, who I believe is known to the members of the Sulik family and maybe to some of the rest of you as well. The song is called The Future, and its verses string together a succession of harrowing images of tyranny, alienation, and apocalyptic destruction. The singer's voice conveys an unsavory mix of lust and anger as the lyrics herald a loss of the distinction between good and evil. It all culminates in a chorus that describes a blizzard in which all measure, order, and form are swept away, and the categories we use to make sense of the world begin to slide in all directions, casting both the world and the soul into a state of chaos. And yet, right smack in the middle of this song, in the midst of all this chaos and disorder, the singer announces the following: I've seen the nations rise and fall. I've heard their stories, heard them all. But love's the only engine of survival. In that line, love's the only engine of survival, which is the title of today's message, came into my head as I was studying the lectionary reading for this morning. Lectionary reading, of course, which we just heard. This is the Apostle Paul's great hymn to love in his first epistle to the Corinthians. And that lyric from Leonard Cohen came to mind, especially I was reading the words at verse 8, which in the translation I was consulting says, "Love never ends." Everything else is destined to come to an end. Nations rise and fall. Every story that has ever been told has both a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. Love alone, we're told, never ends. This beautiful encomium to love is one of the most familiar passages in the New Testament, since portions of it are frequently recited at weddings. Weddings where we celebrate the love between two people who have chosen to give their lives to each other. It's tribute. This passage is tribute to virtues like patience, endurance, not insisting on having your way. They supply a recipe for sustaining the love between two people through a lifetime of trials, not all of which can be anticipated in advance. But, in fact, this passage isn't about marriage. And it's not about the sort of love whose praises, and the sort of love whose praises it sings, is not romantic love. To understand what this passage is really about, we need to familiarize ourselves with the circumstances that prompted Paul to write it, which, as we'll see, have a few things in common with the Leonard Cohen song I just quoted and described. So the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in the Greek city of Corinth, which was a major port city in the ancient world. Paul had spent about a year and a half in Corinth building the church, so he knew these folks pretty well. After he moved on to do missionary work in another city, he started getting some distressing reports that all was not well with the church he had founded in Corinth, that it was being torn apart by quarrels and rivalries. And that's what prompted him to write this letter. We can piece together some of the details from the few particulars Paul mentions. Evidently, other Christian teachers had been rolling through town, and some of them had drawn loyal followings with some of the groups within the church. And now those groups have become rival factions. There was also some sexual shenanigans going on that drew Paul's ire. Basically, people sleeping with people they shouldn't be sleeping with. That happens. And then justifying it by saying, hey, we're free in Christ. What's the big deal? And there was a controversy over whether it's permissible to eat meat that had been sacrificed to idols. In addition to these cliques and divisions, the church couldn't even come together to celebrate a common meal without it becoming a source of conflict. Though the details are not exactly clear, it appears that in this fractured assembly, some were glutting themselves, others were getting drunk, and in general, people were acting selfishly, with little regard for each other's needs. And to top it all off, there appears to have been some ongoing competition over the issue of what are called spiritual gifts. Some people possess the gift of eloquent speech. Some people claim to have greater knowledge, greater faith than others. And these have become a source of pride among some people, as well as a source of contention and resentment, as some held themselves to be superior to others based on the specific gifts they possessed. But, we needn't get too caught up in the specific issues that were causing the church at Corinth to descend into a chaos of the sort that Leonard Cohen describes, since we know from our own experience that once the spirit of rivalry takes hold in any group, there comes a time when the issues fall away. The issue seeks to be important, and people just start quarreling for the sake of quarreling itself. Like the Corinthians, we go from one conflict to the next. The issues in constant flux, but not the ill will. For the spirit of enmity doesn't care what we're fighting about, just so long as we're fighting. Our stored resentments and grudges are always on the lookout for new opportunities to go on the offensive. And that's when things begin to slide in all directions. The scenario in Corinth denounced by Paul is certainly on display everywhere we look. It's in our politics, both domestic and international. But it's also something that we can all recognize in our own families, our social groups, workplaces, charity organizations, and even perhaps sometimes in our own churches. According to Paul, the core of the problem in Corinth, and by implication in all of those other settings where rivalry, division, selfishness, and resentment overturn the order on which our communal flourishing depends, the core of the problem is our failure to understand and to act out of the virtue of, in Greek, agape. That's the Greek word that we translate into English as love. Of course, readers of the New Testament know that love is part of what Jesus calls the greatest commandment. When an expert in the law asked him which of the 613 commandments listed in the Torah is the greatest, he answered, without hesitation, without missing a beat, that it is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, he said, and then immediately added, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on those two commandments. Now look, Jesus could have left things with just loving God, which he says is the first and greatest commandment. That's all he was asked. What's the greatest commandment? Not, can you tell us the top two? But it turns out that loving your neighbor is more than just an afterthought. It is, in fact, the concrete way that we need to practice the love of God in our daily lives. But before we go on, it's necessary to clarify what this biblical love, or agape, really means, and how it differs from some of the other things that go by that name. Perhaps the first thing we need to get clear is that this biblical love is very unlike our modern notions of romantic love. In particular, it's not just a feeling. My favorite illustration of this distinction comes from one of my favorite musicals, Fiddler on the Roof. In case you haven't seen it, Fiddler on the Roof is about a Jewish milkman named Tevye who has been blessed with 5 daughters, 3 of whom are of marriageable age. Of course, the family, being very traditional, believes in arranged marriages, since who better than the parents know what sort of life partner would be best for their child? But Tevye's daughters are modern women with modern ideas, among them being the notion that marriage should be for love. Puzzled by this idea, wondering what it says about his own marriage, Tevye approaches his devoted wife Golda, and he asks, "Do you love me?" And Golda responds, not with a yes or no, but by listing all the things that she's done for and with Tevye over the course of their 25-year marriage. For 25 years, I've washed your clothes, cooked your meals, cleaned your house, given you children, milked the cow. Ending by posing a question of her own. If that's not love, what is? We shouldn't let Golda's very traditional list of womanly forms of drudgery obscure her main point. Her love for Tevye, though it certainly must involve deep feelings at this point, is not reducible to some emotion. What makes her love real are the myriad ways that she and Tevye have built a life together, the sacrifices they've made for each other, the services they've performed for each other, a lifetime of thinking of each other rather than just thinking of oneself. And that has shaped and formed each of them individually and as a couple. As the French philosopher Simone Weil has said, love must pass through the flesh to be real. Golda is making precisely that same point. The feelings of love grow out of works of love. And that helps us to understand the answer to one of the perennial objections to the Christian ethics of love. Jesus says, love your neighbor, for that's the only concrete expression in the world of our love of God that really matters. But what if your neighbor is unlovable? Or, to put it even more bluntly, what if he's a jerk? Some neighbors are. There are some people for whom we just can't muster up warm and fuzzy feelings of love, no matter how hard we try. But that's okay, since warm and fuzzy feelings aren't what love is all about. So with all of that in mind, let's look at what Paul has to say about love. He begins by listing two things that love is. Love is patient. Love is kind. Now, I'll be honest. There are people who rub my nerves raw. But I can still respond to them with patience and kindness. And the more I practice these virtues, the easier it becomes to keep my cool and to treat the other person in the way that I would want to be treated when I'm rubbing his nerves raw, which I probably do. On the other hand, when I respond in the way that comes most naturally to me, with anger and impatience, well, I begin to take on the very same qualities that I hate so much when I see them in others. Even worse, I may escalate a conflict that causes us both to become our worst selves rather than our best. But because emotions are contagious and actions tend to be reciprocated, it's possible to break the spiral of animosity, just by responding differently. It's hard to stay angry at someone who insists on repaying your rancor with kindness, as I've learned from experience. When I reproach people with anger and they have not responded in kind, it's hard to stay angry. Paul next tells us what love does not do. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on having its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Envy, resentment, wishing evil on others, whoever they may be, these are refusals of love. These are the seeds of destruction. When I read this list of things that love is not, again, to be honest, I can't help but recognize myself in it. Not myself all of the time, but certainly myself at times, and all too often. Paul's point is that the conflict tearing the church in Corinth asunder, and again, by implication, the conflicts that make so many of our own relationships so painful and dysfunctional, stem from these vices. The envy, pride, the self-centeredness of the Corinthians is really no different from our own. We live in a society where so much is presented in terms of self-awareness, self-esteem, self-acceptance, self-image, self-realization. It's all about the self, me. And this society of the self is one that is increasingly coming to resemble the apocalyptic scenario described by Leonard Cohen in his song The Future, in which we find ourselves moving steadily into a future that, according to the singer, is murder. For Paul to recommend a way of existence in which a person lives for the other in a life of loving self-sacrifice, well, that's highly countercultural. But as Leonard Cohen tells us, in these perilous times, love may be the only engine of survival. I thank you.